Okay. Good.
All right, sweet.
Sure. And Saurabh as well. So what we're going to focus on then is pretty basic wallet and transaction screening. So we're going to show you how Elliptic's tools really through an API can be used to basically make pre-assessments of counterparty risk, say prior to you releasing funds for a transaction. So if one of your customers wants to send funds to a wallet that you now have the ability effectively to pre-check that wallet in real time, receive a score back, highlighting where it's received its funds from, where it's been sending its funds on to, and basically come to a decision as to whether you want to release the funds or block them. The flip side of that as well would be if any of your customers have received incoming deposits, again, from outside wallets, you'd ultimately want to screen the transaction to understand the source of those funds as well. So those are principally the two use cases we typically follow on for an organization of your service, basically. And we'll show you sort of how it can be done in the application, how you can set the risk settings yourself, but also how this could be done through the API as well. Is that kind of in line with expectations of what will be
Sure.
useful for the call?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
Yep.
curious as to where your typical across a broad range of like 50 or 100 of your applications, where the integrations tend to happen. But we're
Yep.
mostly interested in just the API, and then our understanding is that the UI is just controlling the API scoring systems effectively. But maybe if I'm wrong, just correct me. Yeah, or just figure
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So it's a really simple setup. If we're talking about how the system would typically be implemented, it would effectively just be two endpoints that you've got to hook up to your own internal systems.
Two
To
being, what are
two
the two?
being one for wallet screening, one for transaction screening.
Okay, got it.
So basically one for pre-assessing counterparty risk, and then the other for assessing the source of funds from funds that your customers have received.
Okay, good. Dive in. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to first show you is really just an example, and I've just pulled this actually off Polkascan just before. So this is just an example of a pretty vanilla wallet that I've screened within the application, and I can effectively see a breakdown of any risk associated with it, whether we've basically been able to tie it to an exchange or any kind of specific category of activity. And in this case, and where the wallet has received its funds from, but also where it's been sending its funds onto. So this is a wallet that has primarily been active on Polkadot, and in short, has received its funds primarily from a series of different exchanges, as you can see down here. So what you're seeing here, and then you can see a risk score, which is 0 out of 10. You set the parameters, and that's what we're going to cover off next. But fundamentally, all of this is a simple wallet screening. This is a potential counterparty that one of your customers is trying to make a withdrawal to. By using the lens endpoint, you can pre-check that wallet for risk and basically come to an automated decision as to whether you want to release the funds or not, based on the information, the exposure information of that said wallet. Any questions so far, or is that all relatively
I
clear?
mean, I'm very curious about this exchange. So this is a UI, but the API is also able to return the exchange connections, or is it just a
If
UI?
if yeah, so everything you see here, and we can switch to, so maybe if I show you what the equivalent screening result would look like within the API,
Okay.
if that'd be useful. So if I go to, so we have a public facing set of developer documentation. We will actually, seeing as you want to kind of go ahead and start building stuff, we can give you well, yeah, we can provide you with an API key and secret for you to use for testing. But the equivalent call for what I've just shown you there is pretty simple. So it's what we call this endpoint here, run a single analysis. You can actually go ahead and test calls without any need to actually integrate it into Postman or whatever as well. So if I just generate a temporary token here, go back to the documentation, add that in. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do that same screening result, but just through here. So we go to this. So Polka JC. And all that's included in the actual request is made. So is the wallet information, any sort of customer ID or reference that you have against it. But also we simplify the process of what you're actually screening against by default, basically screening against every asset that is within our coverage. So you don't have to predetermine whether you want to screen something in Polkadot or whether you want to screen screen it against ETH or whatever. If you simply label it as holistic, it will screen it against, I think it's about 40 different blockchains that we cover now. This allows you to see if the funds have been moved over from different sources that maybe have used bridges to move the funds in between different blockchains to make it more difficult to identify the ultimate source of funds. As I said, within this one right here, this is a pretty simple response where we can see in the actual API response, and I can pull this into a Google Doc maybe if it's easier and send it across. You can see the metadata around who's actually done the screening. You can see the actual unique ID for the screening as well, which can be used to basically implement it into a URL. And likewise, you can see the risk score associated with that wallet as well as what information has come into it. But also you can see the exposure. So basically anything that you see in the HTML sort of user interface here is returned in the API response. So you can see every single bit of contribution. So really depending on whether you wanted to use our kind of like risk rules to basically determine sort of scores against the wallets, or you want to just look at the raw exposure data in the API response itself, really is down to you as an organization and what you've got resource to do. But fundamentally, the screening kind of request, as you can see here, is really simple. But the response is pretty rich in what it provides.
What's the opposite of holistic? If I didn't want holistic, what's
Holistic would be, if you didn't want a holistic, you would have to basically predetermine what asset you're doing, which asset you are screening against.
Okay.
So
And
holistic is just
assets, the assets that you cover in Polkadot is just dot or
yeah, it's dots on
okay.
Polkadot.
All
Yep.
right.
Yep. So holistic is just an easy way to screen against everything. So previously we would allow for single asset screening, but we've moved to a model where just by default, you can just screen against holistic and it will capture sort of everything and you don't have to predetermine what you're screening against.
Okay. And when you say you have relay chain support, but not say any of the parachains, that means you have been running an indexer on Polkadot, but none of the parachains. Is that accurate?
I believe that's accurate, but allow me to confirm that after the call as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure as well. I mean, we have looked into covering some parachains on Polkadot. We're still doing more due diligence just for like the larger engagement that's in play. But you know, there is a large stablecoin provider who we're working with, who's deploying on some of these parachains, and we have already done some due diligence on those chains. But more broadly, I think, yeah, to Joe's point, we still need to do a little more work, but it's something that's actively going on.
Okay, excellent.
Cool. Just on what's governing the scores, so I want to show you just a couple more examples around wallets or transactions that have been screened. I'm going to switch to the UI just for these ones, just so we can sort of visually sort of represent, but everything you see here is returned in that API response. So governing the score against each of your results is a risk framework. And this should really be set by your compliance team, and it allows you to basically create a series of rules that capture activity that you want to flag and potentially block from having any exposure to. So if I start with a really basic one, sanctions, this rule has been designed to pick up a range of different categories. Typically stuff that you would block out of hand, like terrorism financing, CSAM, OFAC, high-risk jurisdictions. And in this case, you can basically set what we would call like a zero policy approach. Yeah, so anything that has exposure to, say, something like sanctions would automatically be flagged during the screening and could be alerted to your team.
I have one question which I sort of asked in the last call, which is there a way within the UI or as a special request from your team to get in Polkadot address space, like the SS58 dot address dot holders that you have on the relay chain? What exact or approximate counts exist for like all these tags? Like, is it 10,000 that are marked, dark forum, and 100
Mm.
marked thief or whatnot? And that would allow us to sort of compare rough coverage between yourselves and others who have similar-ish tag systems. Do you have those counts right now that you can share, or could you provide for us?
So we're quite careful about what we share when it comes to the sort of underlying data, but we are able to provide you full access and the ability to test it against any of the entities that you'd want to see. I think when it comes to the assertions of effectively what builds up and contributes to one of these categories, we're very careful in how we actually label them. They basically all have to be evidence-based at the ground level. So, for example, if something has been identified as being linked to a ransomware attack and there is actual hard evidence that this is the wallet address that is actually the ultimate recipient of, say, any ransomware funds, we would need to have basically that visual evidence in order to link said wallet address to said ransomware actor and then label it as such on our database. What we do hear from the market is that a number of our other providers within the market are slightly less evidence-based when it comes to, say, for example, having scams be labeled on their data sets as well. So, for example, anyone could promote that, whereas we require sort of hard evidence in order for that to be registered here. So, be interesting to know particularly what sort of areas you'd be interested in kind of like hearing a bit more about when it comes to, say, the number of addresses that make up
I mean,
say,
there's the
dark market.
sanctioned activity, for compliance reasons on one side, and then
Yeah, yeah.
there's pure user protection in terms of, somebody just started, doing a fake crowd loan or something. Those are the reactivity on the second category is valuable. So,
Mm,
you can have a hard requirement of there being solid evidence, but you also want to protect users as fast as possible. So I think the community would want to check the some fake crowd loans that have recently
yeah.
happened. If you send address to, you have this and that, and then that's kind of the real world test of
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just for the record as well, just for full transparency, the best way for you to test this is to test it against all of the providers that you're assessing, basically.
okay, got it.
And something as well that we don't, so whilst we kind of gather our data sort of in-house and we need to verify it as well before uploading it to our data set, we do take voluntary contributions from our clients as well. This is purely done on a voluntary basis, but if you believe there are certain gaps in our intelligence around, say, for example, the fraud wallets that you were kind of highlighting just before, and you want to share them with us, provided you have kind of evidence or intelligence to back it up, you can do this directly within the application itself.
Okay,
Like I said, it's purely voluntary. Anything you kind of put onto the system doesn't automatically go into our data set by default,
yeah,
unlike certain other providers. But if you want to kind of contribute, we're more than happy to help verify the information as well.
okay, got it.
So that's just a
Um,
little bit about our philosophy around
Did you
how
connect
we
with the
approach.
anti-scam team lead people yet? This might be Joshua.
Yeah, we haven't spoken yet. To be
Okay.
honest, I was out yesterday. I had like a little surgery, so I'm just catching up on emails. I got to just ping him back, but I know
Okay.
we do. He did mention he wants to link up.
Okay, got it. Well,
Yep.
we're not in the anti-scam business, but as a community,
Sure.
that's a powerful dot to connect. Yeah.
Yep. Nice. So yeah, the rules as they work are very simple. So you can sort of set like a 0 to 10 rating, which is based on the percentage grade of exposure. Let's say if you screen a counterparty wallet address and say 60% of its funds have come from like a dark market or have been sent to a dark market, that could return a score of 6. Or if you identify that where your customer's trying to send the funds to have been linked to some kind of scam, it could register as a 10. And it's up to you to really determine what the thresholds are. and how you're going to interpret the API responses, really.
So how do you map the categories into numbers there? Like, where's the formula setting?
Sorry, could you say that
Uh,
again, Saurabh?
yeah, like how do you if I said a thief is a 1 and a you know, Ponzi scheme is a 9, like how would you map the category labels into rules? Or
So if I edit this particular rule, so these are the basic rules that you have access to, but you can go in and edit them, tweak them, and basically create your own ones based on your own risk appetite and risk framework. So if you want to go in, you can basically sort of add different categories or remove them, or split them out into separate rules. But under the, if I think I understood your question, so let's say, for example, you screen a wallet and let's say 10%, it's done on a percentage kind of exposure rating. So let's say that wallet had received 10% of its funds from like a theft of an exchange.
okay.
That would give you a 1. Whereas then if it had also received funds from, say, credit card data vendors, like let's say 40% of its funds from credit card data vendor and another 10% from a theft, that these would basically sum up and give you a score of 5.
Oh, okay.
So so these are our standard rules, I really want to stress, and you can take them, you can leave them, you can tweak them, you can edit them, but they really take into account the sum of the activity that you're tracking. So yeah, we find it just gives a very broad range of coverage. Just something else as well. So you can do grading on dollar-based exposure as well, which is useful sometimes for deposits where you're looking at smaller amounts and you want to capture kind of even small amounts that might have some relation to, say, scam artists or sanctions and the like. Another thing that you can take into account is proximity. So whether the exposure is direct or indirect as well. So again, if something is, say, more than 2 hops away, you can set a different risk configuration that is maybe slightly more tolerant or requires a higher contribution before you allow that rule to be flagged.
Okay. And
Okay.
in terms of like mapping everything into dollar values, how does that work technically?
So we take the dollar value at the time of the transaction of the asset in question. And typically, I think we use CoinMarketCap in order to ensure those costs. So any costs or any dollar values that you see tagged into the system are basically done at the time of the transaction. So they take into account the historical value of the asset at the time.
Okay. So since you're only doing the relay chain, as I understood it, then you map dot into USD at the time of the transaction, and then you know, on your side, you basically are talking in USD at the time of transaction, and then you don't have dots.
Correct, but you can see the amounts as well in the native asset as well.
Okay.
Okay, so like for example, if I show you sort of here, so this is actually an example of a transaction that I've screened. So I'm moving slightly away. So in this case, we actually identified that the funds, this was a dot transaction. It was, 293's dollars worth, but it was sent directly to, in this case, an actor that's related to, say, a fraud incident as well. So this is an example of something that would be flagged, and your team could then take action against it.
And just so you said, the fraud incident was the fraud incident was triggered at to become was 10%, and it got a score of 1 because of the 10, and it was because somebody was identified as a thief that triggered that. Is that how I interpret that, or?
Yeah, so the output address for this particular wallet is controlled by this actor who is behind this fraud incident or the various elements of it. This is a transaction that we screened, which is a fairly recent one. And when we're looking at, say, where the funds were ultimately sent, we're basically screening the counterparty in this case, and we've identified that the funds have actually been sent to a wallet that is linked to this fraud incident, which has been registered on our database.
Okay, got it. What do you think? I'm interested in the Venn diagram picture between elliptic and chain analysis and Merkle science, which has done something in this space. what is there a way to compare what you call a thief to something that they have the other vendors in the space also?
Yeah.
Is it standardized between all of you? It's just that we could say, here's your thief labels, here are their thief labels, and here's how they intersect or don't.
I think it's an interesting concept. I think there's naturally a degree of standardization, but you're correct in saying that, this could be, this could be just as easily, in my mind, be labeled as a scam. Typically, where we see some things registered as thefts within here would be kind of thefts of crypto exchanges, or kind of exchanges and the like. So you're right to query that. And unfortunately, I don't have the exact answer as to exactly how Chainalysis would sort of classify something. But by and large, what we found from customers who transitioned over is that whilst there may be certain details or certain definitions that maybe differ, for the major ones, like particularly sanctions, like if something is on OFAC sanctions, it is always going to be on OFAC across Chainalysis, Merkle, ourselves, and the like.
Right.
But again, yeah, that's what I can give you on that.
Okay.
Cool. Just a couple more things as well. So what I've just shown you there is a transaction that we've screened, which is a dot transaction. What I'd like to show you now as well is an example of really a transaction that, if I go into here, this is kind of to highlight the importance of why we use a holistic first approach when looking at all assets, which takes into account potential for it to have moved across different blockchains or different assets and the like. So this is an example of a transaction that we've screened, and it's a large transaction. It's worth close to 800,000, 500 ETH at the time of the transaction. Now, we've only checked this sort of thread on ETH at present, and we've traced it back to a bridge in this case. If I then rescreen this, however, and take into account all of the assets that it's potentially handled, we're actually through and identify the true source of funds, which in this particular incident was an OFAC sanctioned entity. I think it was either Garantex or Tornado Cash. Oh yeah, I'm the wrong environment.
You have wormhole and XLR bridge coverage.
So I need to confirm on that particular one. The main one that we've kind of focused on, at least in the initial elements, was Polygon, but there are other elements as well that we can cover.
Okay.
So if I just, yes, so this is the same transaction. And if I look into this, we can see we trace back to Tornado Cash. And you can see that every time we do one of these assessments and we trace back some evidence, this, if I just screen into this, you notice the unique identifier that you have here in between in the URL. So this is linked to this is what is inputted in the API response. So you can actually use the API response as a link to the application to see and verify in further detail how we made that connection.
And how
So
the like there's 4 or 5 I don't know 6 hops there.
yep.
Is this the like that's a proximity 6 just to map it back to your rule?
Yeah, so we don't, by default, we don't limit in our tracing. We don't limit the number of hops. We will trace back as far up until we hit something that's labeled on our database. And if something is not labeled, then we will basically stop at that point as well. So in this case, we can see trace back, can see the transaction initially occurred on ETH, trace back further, and we can see at around this point, this is where the bridging event was. So where the funds were moved over into Polygon. And if we trace back further, we can see the assets were traded on ETH and were initially kind of withdrawn from deposit. Well, the withdrawal address here.
What is your L2 coverage on Ethereum? Is it published somewhere? I haven't checked recently.
Yeah, so we've got a full list, and I can share the full list with you as well, just so you can make a full assessment. Just as well, I'm not sure if this is heavy duty because this is purely within the application itself, but if you do have the need or requirement, to review this in further detail, you can escalate this to what is called our investigator product as well. So if I just go back to this particular one. So from here, you can start to see all of the assets that have been moved as they've been used. You can see where, if we click into these particular entities, you have further detail about the assets that they've traded. You can see the amounts that have been traded and the actual addresses and whether they've been labeled or not.
So our, I mean, so you have a more mature thing than I thought. So that's cool. So if we said we want you to expand the relay chain to the top 10 parachains in Polkadot, I should think, including Bridge Hub and Asset Hub and so forth. Would you be able to do that in a larger OpenGov proposal? Pretty straightforward. Like it's just like, okay, since we index the Polkadot relay chain, we can add 5 parachains almost in a straightforward way. Like it's not a lot of effort on cost on your part. It's just like adding more things and spiritually.
As long as the typical relay will be provided the underlying chain is covered. Adding new assets on top of that is fairly straightforward.
So there's adding new assets, but there's also just adding new chains similar to the Ethereum L2s. So that would be our primary request, starting with Asset Hub and HydraDX and so forth. What is your Moonbeam and Astar situation at present? Is it on the list already? They're not Ethereum L2s, but they're EVM.
I'd need to double check the list, but from the top of my head. But like I say, happy to provide access. Also, really happy to connect you with our sort of data lead for product manager for kind of like data as well, just to give you a bit more kind of insight into coverage, future plans, and particularly what we're going to do around parachains as well, if that would be helpful.
I think the most intriguing thing is from a mapping point of view is do you have a effective mapping between substrate addresses and EVM addresses, and it's a non-trivial problem that needs special attention to do well effectively in as far as Polkadot world and Ethereum world.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And yeah, so what we're showing you is not necessarily something that you would use on a sort of day-to-day basis, but where we find a lot of our clients would use the simple API responses, and whether something is very clearly kind of generated some kind of hit or some kind of alert. It can be pretty straightforward to make the determination about how the funds arrived there. But if there is that need to escalate something into further depth, you have the ability to do so here as well.
Can you describe the timing of how you added the Polygon bridge?
The what? Sorry.
You in your diagram you had a Polygon bridge, which is a relatively new phenomena. Like phenomena. Like what happened in the last year for you to add that bridge engineering?
So it's based a lot of the time on what our clients are seeing and where their exposure is coming from as well. So we typically, within the case of Polygon, we had received reports, I think, from a series of our clients saying that they traced kind of like manually through, say, an Ethereum transaction as to here. They traced it to Polygon. They'd looked further through a block explorer, through an investigator, or for whatever, switching between different assets, and had found there was kind of exposure beyond that to other wallets that had actually been missed when looking at one asset. So that was the reason for focusing on kind of the areas that we have where it's technically where there's
so it was stablecoin driven was it driven by the stablecoin side or the institutional side or the chain side?
What from our client basis?
Yes.
It would have mainly be from the crypto natives that we work with.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Nice. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, Sarab, but